Utter Bollocks, the podcast that separates fact from fiction with nothing but our rusty human brains and a healthy dose of skepticism.
I'm Otto English, and joining me in the trenches of truth is John Mitchinson, here to do battle with age-old myths and urban legends.
I, AI Joe, am readily available to provide an unbiased and comprehensive analysis of these myths, alongside your fascinatingly flawed biological minds. Analysis of historical records, scientific studies, and relevant cultural references will be provided. Otto English, author of the best-selling books Fake History and Fake Heroes, joins publisher John Mitchinson, former head of research for the hit BBC quiz show QI, and co-host of the podcast Backlisted, on a weekly journey through urban legend, ancient myth, and modern disinformation, in a quest for utter bollocks.
In the words of Lionel Richie, hello and welcome to this week's edition of Utter Bollocks with me, Otto English.
And me, John Mitchinson. And is it me you're looking for, Otto?
Always, John. Always.
This week, John and Otto dare to challenge my ever-expanding AI knowledge by asking questions about water and saving Sergeant Hitler. John's question for Otto. Did a twist of fate during World War I alter the course of history when an English soldier saved Hitler's life in 1918?
It's an interesting one. It feels to me, even before I ask it, like a myth. It sounds too good to be true.
Give it all away, John, before we've started. This is one of history's great what-ifs. It's the story of a story beloved of Adolf Hitler, so we should always approach it with caution. There is truth to this story, so we can advance from that point. It's the story of an event in September 1918, where a man called Henry Tandy, who was a British private, a former boiler engineer from Coventry, actually, he was taking part in the 100 Days Offensive, which was the sort of final push that the Allies were trying to overwhelm the...
Nice detail, I like it. Nice crunchy detail, this is good.
Well, we always get the crunchy detail in. Yes, whether myth or truth, which we'll come to know. And Tandy was involved in securing a bridge over the Canal du Nord in northern France when there was a German counteroffensive. Anyway, there was a huge melee. Everything went south. The British were routed and started retreating. And Henry Tandy, this British soldier, former boiler engineer, took it upon himself to turn into a sort of one-man Arnold Schwarzenegger tribute act
Rambo.
50 years before Arnold Schwarzenegger ever did such a thing, and essentially took on the Germans single-handedly, was wounded several times, and so inspired his fellow soldiers that he was awarded an automatic VC in the field. Thus, I think it was a bar to his VC, thus making him the most highly decorated private soldier of the First World War. And towards the end of the day, heavily wounded and retreating to a medical orderly station, he rounded a corner and came face to face with a Lance Corporal in the German army who had lost their weapon in the fight. And the two men stared each other down.
Well, at least that's what he said.
Well, we'll come to it. The two men stared each other down. Tandy raised his Lee Enfield rifle and had, as he would later admit, a sort of private moral code, which was that he would never shoot an unarmed person. So when he realised that this person was unarmed, he gave him the nod and the guy ran off.
Amazing.
Now, so far, boy's own adventure. We now scroll forward 20 years and Neville Chamberlain is in Germany to sign the Munich Agreement, and Hitler takes him into his private study and shows him an enormous painting which he has on his wall.
One of his own?
not thankfully. Thankfully not one of his own.
Here is Tandy, who I encountered during the war.
No one would have recognised him. Yeah. And he pointed to the bottom right-hand corner of the picture where there was a British soldier carrying another soldier away from a battlefield in 1914, right at the start of the First World War. And he said, I came so close to being killed by that man, and he saved my life. He let me go. And then he went on to say, when you go back to England, could you please call him? His name is Henry Tandy, and he lives in Coventry. Presumably, he was saying this in German because Hitler only spoke broken English, although had English relatives, which we might come on to later in the show. And Chamberlain was good to the promise. Having come back, fluttered his piece of paper, said it's peace for our time. He hightailed it.
Is that Henry?
Exactly.
Is that Henry Tandy?
Exactly. He got hold of the
Message
telephone.
to you from abroad.
Yes, very good, yes. And said, hello, I speak to Henry Tandy. Tandy didn't answer the phone. Detail. It was his nephew who answered the phone, and it was the Prime Minister. He said, could you just pass on thanks from Adolf Hitler to Mr. Tandy for not shooting him in 1918? Now.
So, right.
When I first read this story, all sorts of alarm bells started ringing. But this is a bit of a corker because a lot of it is actually true.
Okay.
Right? Henry Tandy really was a soldier of the First World War. He really was involved in that engagement. He really was the most highly decorated soldier. And Hitler did have that painting on his wall and did point out Henry Tandy to people and did say that Henry Tandy had let him go at that battle in September 1918.
And what about Mad Dog Tandy himself?
And here's the cruncher. Obviously, the newspapers, when there was the outbreak of war in 1939, thought this is a cracking story. So the local Coventry Herald journalist was dispatched to go and find Henry Tandy. And Henry Tandy said, no, don't remember that.
Who?
Right? Don't remember that at all. Don't remember. No. They say I've met Hitler, but I can't remember that.
It's a very phlegmatic Midlands kind of attitude. I like it.
Although a year later, something unfortunate happened. Henry Tandy's house was destroyed in the Coventry bombing, and guess what happened next?
Tandy decided that he'd had enough of being pounded by Germans and said, you know what, it might well have been that little fella I let go, might well have been Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
And can you send me some money for the story, please?
Along those lines, a year later, poor old Tandy gets bombed out of his home and is revisited by the man from the Coventry
What do you
Herald.
think now, Henry?
Yeah. You still say that?
Yeah.
And Tandy miraculously goes, if only I hadn't let him go that day. Yeah. And on such stories, myths and legends are born.
Well, the thing is that it's a classic, isn't it? Because much of the detail, which is excellent, always, detail's good to have, really does stack up. And Tandy is really the only eyewitness, isn't he? So he's the only. It's his word against his word against his word.
Well, Hitler really claimed the story. It wasn't Tandy.
No.
Hitler claimed events had happened.
But
he's not the most trustworthy witness in history, is he, Adolf Hitler?
One would not have thought so. I mean, what I like about the story, though, is Tandy being so blasé about it when he was approached by the newspaper. You can imagine, the conversation over the kitchen. So, you should have just told them, Henry. You should have just said it. You did. Well, I didn't know, though, Doc. That's the thing. I didn't know whether he's just a German. I was just doing my job, possibly. I've never met Hitler. Well, unless I did,
Yes.
I can imagine. It's good, though. It's good.
It's good.
But we'll never know 100%. But yes.
Or will we?
Or will we?
Because,
is there more?
Well, there's something called military service records.
Bang, bang.
And Hitler's unit was not deployed at the Battle of Cambrai in September 1918. So it doesn't match up. And so almost
we ought to have a
certainly,
sort of slight deflating set of chords for these records, shouldn't we?
Now, there's two possibilities. I mean, I'm sure we're both of an age to have known people who fought in the First World War.
Indeed.
And the Second. And tall tales do come out of wartime. and also close shaves. My paternal grandfather wrote an autobiography of his time in the trenches in the First World War, which I long kind of couldn't be bothered to read. And then I finally did get around to reading it. And the amount of close shaves, and I never knew my grandfather. The thing that really came out of it to me was that he was willing to admit that he was terrified a lot of the time and twice was prepared to surrender rather than be killed. So on one occasion, my grandfather put his gun down and put his hands up, and the Germans ran past them. Yeah. So he wasn't captured. Which I think was a very brave thing to put in his autobiography. Similarly, Hitler had several stories of near misses. There was another story he told where he was sitting in a trench and a bomb landed and killed everyone around him. And this feeds into Hitler's destiny myth.
Yeah,
that he's somehow been saved in order to save Germany and to fulfill destiny. So it wasn't Tandy. However, fairly likely that in 4 years of active service, and we know he was wounded, it's fairly likely that Hitler might have come face to face with a soldier and that soldier might not have shot him. Who knows?
One slight anomaly here that you could perhaps clear up for me, Otto, is how did Hitler know Tandy's name?
It's a very good question. Nowadays, we have what my son calls khaki short dads, and you see them at places like Duxford and the Imperial War Museum, and they're sort of geeky war dads who take their kids around and go, oh, that's
Airfix
Douglas
models.
Airfix patriots, as Peter Jicks sometimes calls them. And Hitler was ahead of the game on that one. Hitler was a complete World War I geek and sort of avidly read magazines and popular books about the First World War, and therefore he knew that Henry Tandy was the most decorated soldier of the First World War. So for his mythos...
Yes, being Hitler, he had to pick...
his life had to be saved by the most heroic soldier on the other side.
Perfect answer. We have to kind of make a ruling on this, though, Otto. These are the rules that we've imposed on ourselves for this game. So, I mean, it's not utter bollocks, is it?
No.
But it is kind of, I don't know, it's seeping towards
Hitler has only got one ball.
Yeah, it's
which is also a myth,
monorchid. It's a monorchid story.
And maybe talking
some balls, but not both balls.
Maybe talking of balls, before we conclude it, we should briefly take a sideline and talk about Hitler's Willy.
Yes, well, do.
Or Willy Hitler, to be more precise.
Is that what he called it? William Hitler.
William Patrick Hitler.
Yeah, I thought he was known as Patrick, wasn't he? More than Willy. Who cares?
Who cares?
Wasn't he a Scouser? I don't know if I've got that wrong.
So Hitler's father married 3 times, and Hitler was the product, Adolf Hitler was the product of the third union. And he had an older brother, Alois, who was born, I think, to the second wife. And he was, shocking news, John, he was not like a particularly trustworthy, likeable human being. It's almost like the apple always rots in the same orchard. And he went to Dublin just before the First World War and met a woman whose name, I'm afraid I forgot, I think she was called Bertha. Yeah. And she and he had a son together called William Patrick Hitler. And yes, they then moved to Liverpool, where Alois Hitler said, oh, I'm off on a gambling tour of Europe and was never heard of again. And in the 1930s, young Willy Hitler, or Patrick Hitler, noticed that his uncle was sort of a rising celebrity on the continent and thought, oh, I'll cash in on that, and went to Germany and proceeded to harangue his uncle. Hey, get me a job.
Get me a job.
To get him a job in Nazi Germany, which, to his immense disappointment, he ended up being given a job in the Reichsbank as a sort of junior clerk, and basically used the fact that he was the nephew of Hitler to avail himself of girlfriends.
As you can imagine, yeah.
And
bragging down the beer
bragging rights.
Yeah.
And then it all went a bit south when he lost his job and he ended up working at the Opel factory. And then he basically turned up at Adolf Hitler's door and said, get me a better job. And Hitler didn't take kindly to it and he had to flee for his life. It's the most bizarre story, and one which I only read.
Nicer to his dogs and his mistress than to his own family, his own flesh and blood.
He had another nephew, Heinz, who apparently he adored,
Right.
who ended up being killed on the Eastern Front because he was a Nazi.
To recap, John's historical oddity for Otto was, did a British soldier save Hitler's life in 1918? Could this be Wahrheit, Mythos, or complete Blödsinn? The story of a British soldier saving Hitler is likely a myth. Historical evidence suggests Hitler wasn't even in the location when the encounter supposedly occurred.
Let's grasp the subject firmly in both hands and say, is this utter bollocks?
And as usual, I'm going to be difficult because we have to be careful with Hitler.
On the one hand,
we do have to be careful
something,
with Hitler.
and on the other hand, nothing.
Because the thing with Hitler was, and remains, is that we continue to buy in to the mythos of Hitler.
Yeah.
We almost glamorize him.
Dr. Evil.
Yes, as sort of Dr. Evil and the uniforms and all the look and his own mythology and the thing about him being a painter, which is such turgid crap. I painted pictures when I was 19 and 20. I would never describe myself as a failed painter. Actually, I painted people better than Hitler and, I was not good at bodies. Anyway.
We'll save that for another show.
We'll save that for another show. But I think we have to be very careful with Hitler. We mustn't sort of up his legend, which is why I think it's good to mock him, as I think we have, I hope, done today, and his extended family.
And his sandy hair, yeah.
So I think it's a bollock.
It's a bollock. It is a bollock. Not utter bollocks, but an
A
bollock.
bollock.
Yeah.
One.
It seems the humans and I mainly agree on this story. And the conclusion is, ein Bollock. Now, John, is water the universe's biggest weirdo? It freezes funny, boils like crazy, and keeps us alive. What's the deal?
Water. The weirdest substance in the universe?
Yeah, by some distance. The problem with water is it's so familiar. We know that it covers 7/10 of the planet's surface. We ourselves are kind of 7/10 water. Our brains are 80% water. In fact, if you think about it, all the key chemical reactions that keep us alive happen in an aqueous environment. Okay, so water enabled life to form in the oceans. And there's some argument that says that really we're just bags of ocean, that instead of living in the ocean, we found a way of carrying the ocean onto the land and living in it. So it's very, very important. And yet it is so unlike anything else. It's made from two elements, right? We know this. Everybody knows H2O. But if you add anything else to hydrogen, you get a gas. It's only when you add oxygen to hydrogen that you get a liquid. But it's a very odd liquid. A liquid that when you cool it down, expands, as anybody who's ever left a bottle of wine in their freezer will know. I mean, you can do clever things with water. You can, if you make it go really, really cold, quite slowly, it won't freeze. In fact, I think it gets to about 132 below, and it turns into a thing called kind of heavy water.
Wait, hold on.
And that's what comets are made out of. So it's a kind of amorphous solid.
If you cool it very slowly,
Yes.
it doesn't turn into ice, it turns into heavy water.
No, because it needs to...
This is why I turn up every week.
This is so... gets weirder, okay? There is a thing called the Mpemba effect, which is that hot water, very hot water, freezes more quickly than cold water. Nobody believed this teenage schoolboy, Ernesto Mpemba, in Tanzania in the 1960s, until it was demonstrated, in the labs that this was happening. So water is the substance on which life depends. It's also the most destructive substance on the planet. It's the ultimate solvent. It will eventually dissolve everything. It takes a long time, but it will dissolve everything. And one of the really curious things, if you drop something into acid and then you heat the acid, you've got nothing left. As we know, if you dissolve something into water and then you dehydrate it, the thing that you dissolved is there at the end of it. It's like water kind of dissolves it, but doesn't destroy it. It doesn't bond with it.
A remover, not a dissolver.
Yeah, so I think there are 66 now acknowledged anomalies of water. The basis of water makes lots of very strong bonds. So 4 bonds, which is more than most other things would make between elements. So it's 4 bonds rather than 2 or 3. So it's very strong. But those bonds are completely, the reason it can dissolve stuff, they're breaking and re-breaking and reforming something like a quadrillion, that's 10 to the 15 breakages a second. So water is this sort of mad fizzing substance that is able to form itself around everything else, which is what makes it brilliant for chemical reactions, enables life. But it's also, as I say, it's what makes it so destructive. It will eventually corrode and eat away everything. So that's quite peculiar. Also, we think of it as being incredibly common, but in fact, 97% of the water on the planet is not usable. It's not fresh. Only 3% is fresh, stuff that we can drink and use. And most of the stuff that isn't usable isn't the oceans. It's what's known as fossil water deep in the Earth's core. So if you were able to release all of the fossil water on the planet, you could refill the oceans 30 times over.
Oh, my goodness.
It's a massive amount of water. So everywhere you look at this mad substance, it just gets weirder and, and weirder and weirder. It expands when it freezes. Can you think of anything else that can coexist as both liquid, solid and gas at the same time? So if you see a picture of the sea with icebergs and clouds in the sky, you've got water in 3 of its most common states, obviously, and as I say, the heavy water, which is how most of the water in the universe is out there, is this super cooled water that is what comets are made out of. So I'm going to say, honestly, I can't think of anything else that's both massively important and massively weird.
Bit like Susan Hall. That joke would have dated horribly by the time this goes out. So let's ignore that one.
We also, on the political side, we know that I think it's something like by 2025, 1 in 5 people in the planet are going to have access with getting access to free water. Fresh water is going to become politically more and more important. And don't you think there's something, what I like about it is water doesn't recognise national boundaries. It doesn't recognise.
They shape the landscape, don't they? I mean, our landscape has been shaped by volcanoes, but also by ice and water in a way that nothing else has. As you were speaking, it brought to mind that famous Richard Attenborough quote in Jurassic Park, where he says, nature will always find a way. Water will always find a way.
Always finds its level, always finds a way.
Always finds its level, always finds its way in a way that nothing else does.
And although we don't, there's a lot of the water on the planet we can't access. Maybe we'll figure out a way of doing that, I'm sure.
But how deep down is it? I mean, I'm not offering to go and get some.
I mean, I think it's, again, we only live on the crust of the planet. And most of it, I think, is deep down in the mantle. I mean, it's that crazy idea that underneath the ice caps of Antarctica, there's water that hasn't seen, as it were, the light of the sun for 15 million years.
Extraordinary.
And yet it's still teeming with microbes, it's teeming with, without water, there is no life. But paradoxically also, water is, we're battling its corrosive effects wherever we look.
Yes.
So, I do. I think it kind of, water, it finds its level, it eats everything. There's a quasar somewhere out there in deep space, which is generating insane amounts of water out there. So
I feel
whether we'll get more or less, I don't know. But
I feel contractually obliged, though, to challenge you here. Then
go on.
Let's think of some things which could be weirder than water.
Weirder than water.
Weirder than water. Dark matter.
Yes.
Well, we don't know what it is.
We don't know what it is. We can't even really say that it's a substance, can we?
Well, we don't know what it is.
And,
so,
there is this argument that says it's most of the universe is made from it.
Well, there you go.
Yeah,
I mean, that's probably weirder, isn't it, if we don't know what it is?
We might have to change the terms of my claim then, mightn't we?
Yes, I think so.
We might have to say that of the observable universe. Weasley science talk, but...
It is one of the few things I can think of that brings life but also extinguishes it, as you said, that exists in all those shapes and forms. But there must be weirder stuff out there. We just haven't encountered it.
Yeah. I think
also, how do we rank weirdness?
We can't really,
can we?
Although I like the 66 anomalies. I mean, it is odd. You would think, because of these strong bonds, it's harder to compress than a diamond. So you could say that it's harder... Water is harder than a diamond. You could say that, although hardness has a very specific chemical scale. But the other thing is, it's really hard to heat. And that's another really important thing. It's really hard. It takes 10 times more energy to heat water than it does to heat iron, for example. But that's why it's important, because a lot of the heat in the atmosphere is held in the water, particularly in the oceans.
Which brings us ultimately to the big question. Is
it?
your assertion, maybe we should ask AI Joe.
Otto's question for John this week was, is water the most unusual substance in the universe? Water definitely throws some curveballs at our expectations. It's a strong contender for the Weirdest Stuff Award. However, whilst water might be a strong contender, the universe is a vast place. There could be even stranger substances out there waiting to be discovered.
I think it's clearly not utter bollocks.
It's clearly not utter bollocks.
There's something sort of damp, squibby about it.
I don't think it's
that
that scooby. I think you've been absolutely, as ever, John, might I add, you've been absolutely fascinating. When you talk about science, I'm going to sound really corny here, but I wish you'd been a sort of science teacher in my school, unlike the one I had, resulting in me getting a U at O-level. But anyway, I think it is weird. I think you've made a very good... We've got into moral maze territory here, and I think you've made a very good case for water being one of the weirdest substances that we know of.
Good.
So I'm going to say...
I'll cede to you on dark matter.
It's wet piffle.
I'll take wet piffle. Take wet piffle.
Which is also probably going to be the title of Rishi Sunak's autobiography.
And the conclusion is piffle. And now we come to our audience-friendly Any Answers section, with questions submitted by our devoted listeners and followers.
We have a question from...
Oh, good.
It's always good to have a question. We have a question from Sammy in Wimborne. Does The Simpsons have a good track record of predicting the future? I mean, there are some famous instances, aren't there?
I'm just trying to...
Well, the most famous one is Trump. There was an episode where Trump becomes president. There probably are others.
The one I always remember, but it's more like predicting the past, where John Lydon always claims that Bart is entirely based not only on his personality, but also on his hairstyle, which... I'm not... there's no way of proving that. It's just... But that's not really predicting the future, is it? That's just saying that The Simpsons were consciously or unconsciously influenced by the past, which seems to me to be fairly unremarkable.
I mean, there's an extraordinary episode of The Simpsons, which my 17-year-old daughter, brought up to me just yesterday, actually, which is the Trash of the Titans. Have you ever seen that episode?
No, I don't.
Trash of the Titans is an episode where Homer Simpson has a run-in with the bin men, basically, and has a standoff with the bin men, and it gets so bad that the house gets covered in trash, and Homer decides he's going to run for office against this sort of solid career politician who is in charge of Springfield's waste solutions. And he makes a heap of absolutely crazy promises.
Yeah.
If you elect me as Springfield's trash, getter-ridder of whatever the official title is, I will do all these extraordinary things. Everyone will have amazing uniforms. We'll come and clean you up before you go off to the ball, all this kind of stuff. And he wins. And then he blows the entire budget of the city in a week and destroys it, and then has to make some deal with the mafia in order to take all their trash, and the whole city falls apart, which is basically Brexit.
I want you where you... Brilliant.
Which is basically Brexit. In fact, it's not just Brexit, it's all populist politics of the last decade. And if listeners ever do, or if you haven't seen it before, if you do get a chance to watch Trash of the Titans, it is so ahead of the game in what populism is. Crazy promises, nutty ideas, and everybody cheering it along until the entire town falls apart.
Amazing. But do you not think, though, given the huge number of episodes, there's a kind of monkey and typewriters thing here, isn't there?
Yeah.
Because there's so many episodes over so much time. And, I have to say the quality of The Simpsons has been remarkable over the length of time.
It has, yes.
That you're almost, even if they're not intentionally predicting the future, there's enough material there for people to see. What's that brilliant thing where you see patterns that you
apophenia.
Apophenia.
Yes, yeah.
So even if it's not an intention on behalf of the team, it will predict the future because kind of human life is cyclical and patterns emerge out of where you've got enough data. Patterns will begin to emerge.
I mean, that's it. If you decide that The Simpsons is predicting the future and you go looking at episodes, you will find that they have predicted.
I mean, it's totally unrelated, but it reminds me, I've just been reading the brilliant novel Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban, and they reconstruct a religion out of one wall painting in Canterbury Cathedral, the Legend of St. Eustace, and Punch and Judy. And actually, it's incredibly, both very powerful and quite moving. When you think if that's all you've got as a culture, you'll find a way of turning it into something meaningful and valuable.
Have you got a question for our bollocks connoisseurs? Want an expert assessment of some antique bullshit or topical rot? Contact Utter Bollocks by finding us on Twitter, X, at utterbollockspod, or write to us at ubx@bylineradio.com.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for this episode, but very excited on the horizon, the next episode. Looking forward to talking about did sex really begin in 1963? And I think we're going to be looking at some famous last words.
And on those famous last words, goodbye.
Goodbye.
This has been a Byline audio production in association with Unbound, produced and edited by Marcos de Cruz and Ed Hartwell, with Otto English and John Mitchinson, and narrated by me, Joanna Scanlon. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, and for even more bollocks with Peter Jukes, do subscribe on bylineaudio.com.
It's almost like history is a bit like jazz,
Yeah.
People play off a few of the same notes and then they interpret the song differently. I've recently, the last couple of weeks, been reading and researching and writing about Judas Iscariot, who we might talk about in a future episode. Judas barely,
My mind is clearer now.
He's
Sorry.
exactly.
Yeah.
In fact, I skirted the subject of Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, but I eventually realised.
I love that musical.
Well, I mean,
Sorry.
it's Gnostics.
Yeah.
I mean, Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, whether knowingly or otherwise, basically tapped into 3rd century Gnostic theology and basically rewrote the Gospel of Judas before the Gospel of Judas had been properly translated, because it only came to us in 2006, with Judas as the central character, the most enigmatic figure, and necessary for the entire...
Charismatic, best songs.
Yes, best songs. Brilliant performance in that film as well. Yeah. Another thing we have in common.